Welcome back to today's Fireside chat with a very humble and unassuming title, State of Macro, Convergence, Big Remaining Issues. I'm Massimo Rostagno from the Monetary Policy Department of the ECB, and these two gentlemen need no introduction, so I won't introduce them. They are two fathers of contemporary macroeconomics, and so this is why I would ask you all to give them a very generous welcome. Thank you for being here and having accepted our invitation. So the plan of this Fireside is we have more or less 1 hour and 15 minutes. Is to divide it in three sessions, one question per each session. So I will give each of you 7 minutes to answer the question. I will first ask the question, and then you will answer. Then at the end of each session, maybe I will give you some time to come back to a point if you want to. Otherwise, we will move to the next session, and at the very end, we will open the floor to the audience. Okay, now there is no fire, as you see here. There is no fire, but I expect a lot of fire in the questions and in your interventions. So, first question is on mainstream model, the dominant paradigm par excellence. The new Keynesian model. So that model was born more or less 35 years ago. 3 equations, no investment, no labor market, no external sector, no fiscal authority, nothing. Just bare bone minimum. Now we have a multi-sector version of that model where you can study all sorts of value chain frictions. You have a more refined formula for repricing than Calvo. You have non-trivial financial sectors. You have heterogeneous agents. So it has been an augmenting agenda all through these 35 years of life. And policy-making institutions like this, but many others, use that model to do macroeconomic diagnosis, to do simulations, to do even forecasting, and with not bad results also. Yet, some people would argue that this research agenda is fundamentally misguided. So the model is super stylized, remains super stylized, lacks intrinsic persistence. Don't look at me like that. It's difficult to relate shocks that you have in these models to real world shocks. And at the same time, like technology shocks, but there are other examples. And at the same time, you don't find in these models, say, swings of sentiment that you identify when you read the economy every day as big shifter, big drivers of economic fluctuations. So the question might be, wouldn't it be more productive to restart from a clean slate? Okay, for example, use machine learning and high-performance computing to aggregate thousands, possibly millions of decision rules, and then aggregate, and then simulate those. I'm sure you can calibrate those rules using experimental economics results. You get a lot of divergence, a lot of heterogeneity from those studies. And maybe you get all the persistence that you are looking for. So, Olivier Blanchard, you have reflected deeply on the virtues and shortcomings of the dominant paradigm. Larry, you have initiated much of this DSG augmentation agenda. We would love to hear your views on this. Is it incompleteness or is it radical misspecification?
Good. Well, thank you.
Olivier Blanchard.
Thank you for inviting me. I must say I've rarely seen such a biased question. Incompleteness or fundamental misspecification. after describing us as the fathers of the field. Anyway.
This is where the fire comes.
So at least you were nice enough to send the question a few days ago. So I had time to think about it. I'll try to give you my best answer. I'm more, not surprisingly, I'm slightly more optimistic than you are.
No, just reporting.
I thought I would make 4 points. The first one is that I argued in a recent paper that there had been substantial convergence in the field. And for those of you, the few of you who were born a while back, you may remember the 70s when basically there was just incredibly strong tensions in the field. I think that's largely gone. And I think we largely agree on what I would call the fundamental assumptions. And I would basically list 2 of them. I think that they are the main 2. The first one is nominal rigidities. And that was far from an obvious outcome, in the sense that that's not the first distortion you'd think about when you think about going away from an hour de Breu economy. Why should it be that? But I think one side, the new Keynesian side, was always convinced it was important. But the other side has largely shifted as well. I did a poll of 27 macroeconomists who have contributed to the literature from the new Keynesian to the new classical. And I think it was fairly unbiased sample. And I asked the question, how important is nominal rigidities to macro? And I got 23 answers out of 27 saying yes. That's a major, major change. And your whole job is based on assuming the existence of these rigidities. The second is the importance of forward-looking expectations. The fact that much of what happens depends on what we think is going to happen in the future. So I think there really has been convergence. That's the first point. The second point is about the new Keynesian free equation model. And I think what it does is basically embody these 2 assumptions. So you have the Calvo equation, which basically embodies in some form nominal rigidities, and then you have the Euler equation, which basically embodies expectations affecting the IS curve. So I think it does that. Does it have flaws? We don't believe any of the 2 equations, as you said. Calvo clearly doesn't have enough persistence. It's obvious. And it's clear that the degree of forwardness of expectations in that model is much too strong. We think a bit about the future, but not about the infinite future. And that has big implications. So it's clear that, it is too simple in fundamental ways as well. So can we think of a modification of a free equation or 4 equation model which would be better? I think we can, but that's what we have. And what it has done is provide a core, a common core in which we can basically discuss issues starting from there. So we can put a distortion and then see what happens. And again, if you compare this to 40 years ago, it would have been absolutely impossible to have that discussion. 80% of the macroeconomists would basically agree. We start from there. We don't stop there, but we start from there. The third point is the relation of the free equation model to the kind of beast that Larry has constructed, the DSGs. And the way I think about this is I think of a Meccano set. And for those of you who are not too old, you might know what it is. It's basically a set of pieces from which you can build bigger and more sophisticated stuff. And I think of the Enkemo as Erector set 1, which is the one you start with, which has the engine and a few wheels, and then you can build on that. And I think of that as being the way to discuss things. We think that the distortion is important. Let's just put it in that model, or many distortions, let's put them in that model, one at a time to understand what they do, and then together, which is what Larry did. And then we can have a discussion. And that discussion is precious, I think. And again, a major change. Now, let me criticize Larry, because that's a fireside chat, right? Which is that the two initial big DSG malls were Christiano events and Icon Bomb, right? And then the other was Smet and Wooters here. And they're awful. They're absolutely awful. But I understand why, and I think it was the right way to go, which is they said, let's try to get back closer to the data. And there are pieces there are some persistence in the data we don't understand, so let's assume that there is external habit persistence or cost of changing investment. And I think they knew, Larry may tell me I was wrong, that they knew that these were shortcuts. But I think since then, basically I think part of what we've all tried to do is say, well, let's look at investment a bit more closely. Let's put investment first, which wasn't there, and then let's think of why there would be these persistence mechanisms. And for consumption, I think we're much closer to understanding this without some crazy assumption. So I thought it was a tremendous breakthrough. Again, with sharp limitations, but I think we've done well. The last question, which was, I think you didn't mention today, but was in your notes, which is models. Should we have one model? And you had this crazy idea of using ChatGPT to create it. But leaving this aside.
It's not mine, huh?
Well, somebody else, but give me a name. I'm very much in favor of a panoply of models. I think we need small ones. In which we basically kind of, the Dombush model, the Ramsey model, the Diamond model, in which we basically put things together, and we know it's too simple, but we understand it fully. We need models like the sons and daughters of Larry, bigger, and this has happened. We need models in which sometimes we go away from explicit optimization, because we're not going to get there. So I have a paper with Ben Bernanke on the inflation episode, which is very old-fashioned. I think it could be derived, but I didn't feel the need to, and it was a useful way of describing the data. And I'm worried that the profession underplays everything else than fully optimized DSGs. The last thing I would say is I think for the distortions, again, I think of macro as you start with RWA and you put distortions, closed markets, and so on, have behavioral different from the standard. And I think that it's terribly important to start with partial equilibrium, both in theory and in empirical work, before you put it in a DSG. And I see too little of that. Okay. I'm minus 1 minute longer, so I'll stop.
Very good. Larry.
Well, Massimo, thank you for inviting me to be here for this and to sit. It's an honor to be here. And your questions were really interesting. Actually, it was surprising to me how interesting. I mean, I hadn't thought about them. I was surprised that they were interesting. I hadn't thought about it. And then the answers that I came up with, I was also surprised by. So try to cover this. So one of the issues that's raised, that Massimo raises, is the issue, why do we have models? And then the other one is a hint of disappointment that our models are complex. So I'd like to talk about that just a little bit. Like, why do we have models? So I think that the experience, and I know Olivier is taking the same view, the experience of the last 10 years has seen a radical shift in kind of the world several times over. We're right in the middle of another one right now. God knows where we're going to end up next week or the next month. But 2008 was a big shock and shook people's views about the world. And then the sovereign debt crisis in Europe was another, it wasn't supposed to it was supposed to be illegal, actually, under the Maastricht Treaty. And and then we have COVID, and so we have all kinds of things that are constantly shifting the world a lot. The world we're dealing with is kind of like different from time to time. And the question is, okay, what's the role of models in that context? Well, the role of models is that it has to do with the fact that we cannot do randomized controlled trials in any macro economy, but certainly not in a shifting one. Like when we wait for the invasion of Ukraine and then we quickly do a randomized controlled trial to see how uncertainty affects fiscal policy, can't do it. You cannot do randomized controlled trials in macro international. And that's why we have to do the experiments in our heads. I mean, that's why we have to have models. And so the next thing I want to say is, why do these models have to be complex? And I think one way to answer that question is, I went to this talk by Ariel Rubinstein some years ago. It was at Northwestern. And he was talking about models. And he said the first rule of models is they have to be simple. Basically, if you write down a model, it can only have 3 variables. And they should have the Greek names alpha, beta, and gamma. No time subscripts allowed. So just one, the idea was that a model is something that allows you to think about a particular idea in isolation from other ideas. And you make it so simple that you just can't help but understand it. Now, the problem in macro is you don't get to pick the economy. In fact, that's the whole exciting thing, is there's a thing out there we're trying to understand. And that thing cannot have different assumptions based on what your preferences are. It is what it is. And in particular, it's very easy to see why you're inevitably led to a complex kind of reasoning world in models. So let's take an example. We've been talking about tariffs today, so let's take an example of tariffs. Suppose I raise a tariff. Well, it seems like, the Econ 101 or whatever answer to the question, what is the effect on GDP of a rise in tariffs is, well, I'm going to stop buying that foreign stuff, and I'm going to buy more of the domestic stuff. That's going to make production in the domestic economy bigger. And okay, that sounds great. Then you think for a while, because remember, it's not that you're not in the position of Ariel Rubinstein at all. You're in a position where the economy is whatever it is. So then you say, well, wait a minute, what if imports go down, what does that mean for the dollar? Probably the dollar will appreciate. There's less supply of it on the market, so the dollar will depreciate. And then foreigners will find it more expensive, or might find it more expensive to buy stuff from me. So now I've got 2 things rolling here. One is foreigners buying less stuff from me, so I produce less. The other one is I'm buying more stuff from myself, so I produce more. And the fundamental question is, well, which one dominates? But that's not the end of it, because we learned about substitution, elasticities of substitution this morning. That it could very well be that some of your imports are essential for production. And that if that the elasticity of substitution is close to 0, and so the only way you can escape buying those imports is just to shut down your production. Well, that gives you another reason why maybe the response to input tariffs, which is that you buy less imported goods, may actually entail a fall in domestic production. Another step we've taken away from the Rubinstein thing. It gets even more complicated because, and I think I got this afternoon as well, which is in the case of tariffs, when we think about tariffs, surely the elasticity of substitution is a function of the time horizon. So if on any particular day, I'm kind of stuck with my inputs, I can't do much about it. A week, a month, maybe a year. We heard about 3 years. There are these search frictions, but I want to think about, elasticity as a substitute. All production functions are reduced form objects, so they're not micro-founded. And so I want to think about a production function with elasticity of substitutions as capturing some of the stuff that you were talking about. And in particular, I would start thinking about elasticity of substitution be a function of time horizon. In the short run, elasticity is very low. So that means output should fall when you have a tariff. In the longer run, it's easier to adjust, so your output may be positive. So now you get another factor involved, and of course you don't get to assume what the economy is. It is what it is. and it has all the frictions, that it has. And it's almost certainly not a Rubinstein economy. Now, does the Rubinstein type of reasoning help you if you're going to build a complex economy? Absolutely. This relates a little bit to Olivier's statement about partial equilibrium. What you want to do is, it's actually general equilibrium in a baby model. So you can do a baby model with one little channel and study that until you know it really well. Then do another baby model which has another of your channels, so you know what the partial effects of all of these things are. And that's the best way to know and understand a complex model. By the way, a feature of modern times is that you have a lot of young people. We have one of them sitting here, Guido, but then there's Straub and Mike, Matt, Ben. You have all these people who are, well, they're crazy. They're crazy about detail, but they're also crazy about intuition. So you get tons of papers that give you lots of intuition about complex models. The news is good about complex models. They can be understood. So now I think I'm going to stop here.
Can I briefly go back?
Absolutely. So you
No, I mean-
some minutes, not many. Huh?
No, two remarks. I mean, I very much agree. I think your argument was very convincing. Two things. The first thing is what simple means. And I think in the old days it was reducing it to two equations, because then you could do a phase diagram. And a lot of time was wasted reducing something which was inherently 3 or 4 equations to 2. And the technology has enormously changed. So we can do simulations and understand. So we can understand a 3-equation model, 4-equation model fully. On the very large ones, the one that Larry was talking about, I think they do not need to be black boxes. I think that with enough training, you can actually understand it. I think this comes, again, from doing partial equilibrium first, so understanding all the effects that Larry has talked about, one after the other, and you can do empirical work on each of them, then putting them and then seeing whether there are things you haven't thought about. But again, I think it need not be, it is not inherent in a 20-equation model that it be black boxy. It's going to give you results you did not expect, nearly always, but then you go back and you try to understand. So I would not accept the notion that there's a necessary trade-off. Big models can be understood.
Larry.
Well, I hope this was clear, because I do think they can be understood, and I think that we've had some remarkable advances on, like the title of the one paper, the intertemporal Keynesian cross, is just, it captures the whole thing, because they're talking about a heterogeneous agent infinite horizon model, and somehow it's a Keynesian cross, which, by the way, it is. But if you look carefully, you'll see it's an infinite dimensional space. So there is a huge amount of progress in understanding complex models. I don't think there's any reason to be, worried about them. By the way, there's one thing you'll never ever figure out without actually doing the model, which is which channel dominates. This channel pushes output down by 5. This channel pushes output up by what? If it's more than 5, then output goes up. If it's less than 5, output goes down. So I don't think there's any way to use intuition to decide on those very critical quantitative questions about which channel is the strong one. That I don't think there's intuition about. You just have to sit down and grind the numbers. I don't know, are we looking at what are we doing?
Yeah, sort of.
We're not doing well.
I know, it's going negative.
Yeah, I give you another 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. Let's see. I was, one of the question I was, one thing that Massimo said, a lot of other things which I'm not able to respond to right now, but one of them was, have we gotten convergence in models? So I took a double take.
Oh,
there.
no, that's for the second.
Oh, that's the second one.
Oh, yeah.
You're fine.
Hold on.
Okay. All right. Well then. Oh shoot. Let's see.
Okay. So let's maybe. Do you have more?
No, I
Not
got
consensus.
confused. I thought the model thing was convergence was in one rather.
No, it's two.
It's coming.
It's coming. So fascinating remarks. Really, thank you very much. I only know that both of you studiously avoided the million of decision rules issue and question.
What do you mean?
I don't want to do that.
Are you okay?
I do think that's where we're going.
You do.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see.
And even at a simple level,
But say it.
we have to go there even before this monster down the road.
Yeah.
I think just simple things like computing steady states is becoming impossible, and it's just a bunch of head scratching that you have to do to compute a steady state, get a strategy for computing it, and AI should be able, and I'm sure it does already. And so yeah, AI is going to revolutionize modeling. It's going to make it very simple for us to put together models. Right now, if you try to get ChatGPT to put the model together, you can ask it to do the 3-equation model, that's fine. Anything else, you're going to try and strangle it, which is really hard to do. But you can see down the road, you can do vibe programming. You say, I would like to have a multi-country model with these kinds of features, please arrange it for me. In 1 minute, it'll have a model.
Right.
Yeah.
It's going to change a lot of stuff.
I agree with that.
Anyway, thank you very much. So let's go to the second, which is in fact an extension of the first. So let's interrogate a little bit more this methodological consensus. Now in today's mainstream macroeconomics, so the agenda is concentrated very much, is focused on developing general equilibrium effects. Has this come at the price of missing critical details in the partial equilibrium perspective? And then what about a very big granular data set? No, they tend to be utilized in extra model, small partial equilibrium, empirical exercises, not so much in the big model. Is there a way that can be changed? No, they can be integrated more intimately into this framework. And then Olivier Blanchard recently noted that some of the progress in mainstream modeling, for example, deviations from rational expectation, in fact, represents an unwind of earlier methodological breakthroughs. And I'd be curious, we'd be curious to hear your views on this. And I'll start now with Larry.
Oh, and so the one thing I wanted to say some things about was the question of convergence and whether it's even desirable. So I think that where we are now, it is still a good idea to try to keep the model from blowing up and getting complicated. So it does make sense for some purposes to say, for example, just use standard sticky price formulas. I think if in your judgment it's not going to affect, it's going to give you the non-neutrality, but it won't affect centrally your conclusion, I think using sort of standard sticky price models is probably a good idea. But it's clear that's not the only model. In fact, those are rotten models. They're not really models. We don't even know what they are. They're just assumptions about things. So I think that when we want to think more carefully about this sticky price stuff, it's a good idea if it's important, and it's a good idea to do it. Let me give you an example. Suppose that you're interested in studying VAT taxes, the impact effect of a VAT tax. Typically what happens with VAT is that, I'm thinking about Japan as an example, and there was an example in Belgium. And so the VAT tax is very controversial. Nobody likes to pay taxes at all, and VAT tax has to be paid by everybody, so they don't like it. So there's a big debate about it, and it's very public. Everybody knows about it. And then what happens is it goes to the Parliament. The Parliament passes the law, and it's going to be the VAT tax is going to be implemented 7 months from now. Okay, and now you might wonder, well, what's going to happen, to prices? Well, now you have to be careful, because now this is a question about actual pass-through prices. So you don't want to necessarily assume kind of like one of these three menu costs, sticky Calvo, and I'll call it Baby Rottenberg for reasons I'll explain in a minute. Baby Rottenberg, Calvo, and menu costs. You got to be careful because Well, first of all, there's a really cool paper by Auclair, Rongley, and Straub. Now I'm citing my colleague twice. So there's a really cool paper by them, which shows that all these three models, they imply the same reduced form Phillips curve. In particular, they imply that the inflation today is a function in part of expected inflation tomorrow and marginal cost today. So that means that implicitly they imply that you're looking at all marginal costs from today till the future. I was really shocked actually when turns out menu cost models do that. Well, now think about the VAT tax. If you're going to have a VAT tax 7 months from now, and you put in these three price setting mechanisms, all of them will give you the same result, which is firms will start raising prices right away in response to the VAT tax. But I think generally, I mean, I've looked at a bunch of examples. The VAT tax does not move until, well, in the case of perishable goods, the night before the tax is actually implemented. So you can't use one of those models to think about the effect of a VAT tax because you're basically assuming something that people have decided isn't right. So what is the right model of sticky prices? Well, Rottenberg, I think, had the right model of sticky prices. His first paper, 1982, where the PT minus 1 squared, that was a vague rendition of this model that was in his head. And it's nicely described in his introduction, which was a customer and firm asymmetric information search model. I was thinking about that in an earlier paper. So there's this customer-based model, and to me, I think it is the right model. And he wrote it out in a kind of behavioral way. Other people have done it in rational expectations. That model is ready, to move. That model does not look at the future. It would not imply a rise in prices when the VAT tax is imposed. So just to wrap this up, because now I'm going, I don't know what, just to wrap this thing up, I don't think we want just one model out there because we have different questions that we want to ask. And sometimes the question, and the question should determine the model you use to answer it. And also, the part of the model that you should think about really seriously should be the one that's closely related to the question that you're asking. So in the case of sticky prices, I think it would be a big mistake to think about VAT taxes in the context of any of our standard sticky price models. And there's a payoff to thinking more carefully, and I think Rottenberg had produced that model.
Oh, 2 minutes.
You don't have to use it.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I got to say. Okay, I'm going to stop. No,
okay.
The moment has passed.
Okay. Olivier.
Good. So I have a credit of...
Yes, 2 minutes. More.
No.
No, it's 7 now.
Okay. So actually gave me a lot of ideas listening to Larry. So I'll take your answers, your questions in reverse order, which is granular data. That's a gift of God, I think, for macroeconomists. But it probably has to go in 2 steps, which is we use the granular data to understand better some behavior, and then we take the equation which comes out and put it in the DSGE or whatever model we like. I don't think we can use it directly. But the number of examples, I think, where granular data allow us to make progress is very wide. I mean, for example, on consumption, I think we understand consumption much, much, much better as a result of following consumers and seeing how they react to unanticipated shocks and so on and so on. So I think the ideas, we're very close, my sense is, from the micro evidence, the granular data, we're very close to having more of consumption, which actually fits the facts. You may disagree, but the other example is VAT pass-through, and I happen to have a paper recently on automatic stabilizers, which basically thinks about a variable VAT rate, which is a way of changing the intertemporal price of things. And I looked at the literature, and I think there we can learn an enormous amount. There has been a lot of VAT changes over time. We have data, we can have better data now. Some of them permanent, some of them transitory. and the pass-through is fairly substantial, for example. So that's another case in which, we can actually take a number. On the sticky price, I love Julio, but I think the Calvo model has the weakness that is its strength. It's incredibly nice, and it's completely wrong. In the sense that if you think about other forms of stickiness, okay, you get very different results. So I have a paper which is a complete flop, which I wrote in the 1980s, in which there was a supply chain, just like that. And at each step, the odd people were changing prices every 2 periods in odd periods, and in the others in even periods. And that gave an enormous amount of persistence. So stickiness is not, so I think we're misled by Calvo. But again here, if we actually go to actual pricing, which Anil Kashyap did once in a while, and there has been more work since, we can actually make enormous progress. So that's, on the granular data, it's great. On the methodological convergence, I think my answer is yes and no. Distinguish the empirical work and the theoretical work. On the empirical, they use again to be wars of religion. You had Prescott on one side, if you do a VAR, I will never talk to you again. And then you had the VAR guy saying your calibration is numbers out of a hat. God knows where they come from. And I think we've learned that we can integrate the two, we can estimate the SGs one way or the other. I'm all in favor of a set of approaches, which is from VARs to calibration, to maximum likelihood, to even all the new techniques which come from basically AI. So there I'm perfectly happy with the heterogeneity. On the theoretical side, I think there is a convergence to some principles, which is, to the extent you can, you should basically have dynamic optimization of the firms, of the people, and then market equilibrium. And you should do this in an explicit way so that you can do welfare. Now, doing welfare in some of these models is tricky because you've made assumptions which may not necessarily be the right ones. But I think that is largely agreed, and I agree with that. Now, let me basically object to something you said, which is, I said that we should unwind some of the assumptions. I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true in the same sense as Tom Sargent thought rational expectations is the way to go, and then he said, well, it's actually fairly complex. Maybe let's think about learning. And I think it's exactly the same thing here. It's one thing to say people maximize. It's another thing to say they maximize von Neumann-Morgenstern utility function. We know that they don't. We know some ways in which they systematically don't. And I think behavioral has gotten to a point where we can actually write optimization problems for consumers, which are much closer to the way the consumers themselves think. So it's not an unwinding. I think it's a next step, rather than moving away from something that we believed earlier. Let me see if I've said everything. I had made the point about partial equilibrium. I think that is an essential part. And again, in terms of methodology, I don't think I see enough of it. The idea of building something which then you take to a DSG model. I've made that point before, so let me stop. And you have another 1 minute 20 to...
We have 3 minutes, war chest.
So I don't know if Larry wants to respond to something.
Rejoin.
Well, so I agree on the optimization. I think I understand. I think we all think that we should write things based on optimization. But what exactly is being optimized would be very, my guess in the long run is going to be very different. So I think that what we're going to see is models where preferences are based more on what involve also what psychologists think about how people assign preferences. I mean, we've learned that the rational expectations, there was a time when everyone thought that rational people would have rational expectations. Almost by definition. Actually by the words makes it sound that way. But it turns out that rational people living in a new Keynesian economy, they would not believe, they wouldn't have the rational expectations beliefs. Guéneri showed this. So there isn't any theoretical foundation, there's no empirical foundation, so it's probably a good idea to move on at some point. And I think when that movement occurs, we should stick with optimization, but the problem should be different. So for example, there's this stuff on system one versus system two thinking. So you kind of have one system where you're going on habit and you're following simple rules, and then things get a little bit out of whack. Then system two steps in and thinks really hard. And so in that framework, there is an optimization, a decision when to switch from system one to system two, and so on. And you have to take a stand on welfare as a consequence. And so now you have what Olivier was talking about, which is you potentially can have a social welfare function, but what is being optimized could be very different, and I hope will be very different from what we're looking at now. The most embarrassing equation in economics, besides Tobin's Q thing, is the Euler equation, and it just lives in the model. Ben has a nice model where nobody is on their Euler equation with Ben and with Paco Buera. I'm thinking about that one. So there's nobody following an Euler equation, although the economy looks like it is, but it's not really following it. But so my guess is that we're going to, when Olivier says optimization, I think we probably agree on this, is that yes, we should stick with optimization. People are, embrace pleasure and they flee pain. That's a fundamental principle we should never leave. And but what it is that they're doing and what their constraints are, I expect will look very different in the future. And then all your machine learning and whatnot is going to come in handy.
Can I footnote? An example, science, which is extremely relevant to the discussion of the anchoring of expectations and the inflation target. So it is very relevant to monetary policy. And it's very clear that when numbers are low, we basically don't think about it. So, if inflation is less than 2%, we don't think about it. And then there's a threshold at which we go above, and then people wake up and they go to system two. Yeah. And then you're in trouble, right? The ECB is in trouble. And I think that is something that we can put, and we put it implicitly in our discussions of the anchoring of expectations. But I think that's something that we can probably formalize and put in our models.
There is a kind of a nice model on that written here at the ECB by Matthias Farkas, who's now at the IMF, with Christofel as his co-author. And they have this thing where in normal times, you sort of think your inflation is going to be low, but you can be triggered into thinking that it might switch. And if you are triggered into thinking it might switch, that's a problem for the central bank, because now the central bank has to say, well, should I get rid of these expectations of high inflation and thereby create a recession, or to do that, create a recession, or should I just let go of inflation altogether? And so we don't want to be in a situation like that. And they have a model where that can happen. And in that model, the probability of switching to beliefs about that de-anchoring beliefs, the probability of that happening is what they call credibility, stock of credibility. And they show for the ECB at the beginning of the COVID inflation, credibility was very high. And, and then the COVID inflation occurred and it was higher than expected, longer. It's just like the US. Longer than expected, and that by the end of this thing, credibility is quite low, so that if you tried to do it again, you could actually have a problem. And I don't want to say that that's the last paper, but I think it's a very nice contribution to this whole discussion of de-anchoring, which gets a little bit away from rational expectation. I mean, people talked about de-anchoring way back in the day, but those were all rational expectations models, multiple equilibria, stuff like that. And the stuff that Christofel and Farkas do that's a deviation from rational expectations. People are just following these rules.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, this gives us an ideal handoff to the next, which is the last session. of this Fireside. So this conference has a subtitle. No, it's an 8th edition, as a subtitle, Bridging Science and Practice. So we conclude with the intersections between theory and history, the last session. So think on the state of the macroeconomic debate 50, 55 years ago, okay? Probably without the events of August 1971, when the dollar was delinked from gold, and the world was thrown into sustained stagflation, the rational expectation revolution, which has a very strong focus on expectations de-anchoring, wouldn't have been such a big deal. That's an hypothesis. In a way, runaway inflation gave everybody the proof, something that they were experiencing in their lives, gave them the proof that the new paradigm was relevant, was bringing relevant insights. Now we are living through a period of similar upheavals. The international monetary and trade architecture is being rewired profoundly. And sacred principles of monetary theory and monetary practice as well, like monetary dominance, with many looked at as a bedrock of effective inflation control, these principles are called into question. So do you see directions in which these historical events, and we don't know where they will bring us, but somewhere, may influence the thinking of macroeconomics and shift the direction in any directions? You have lived through and actively participated in policy debates that have polarized macroeconomics over the years. With the benefit of hindsight, what ultimately resolved those controversies? Was it, let's say, stronger empirical evidence, more elegant math? And now I quote you what you said before, in the spirit of being beautiful and incredibly wrong, or more compelling narratives that proved decisive, shift the tilt of the debates. And I will start here with Olivier Blanchard.
So, and the shift, what's striking in terms of practical macro or macro policy is the change in monetary policy, which really has nothing to do with the way you would have described it 50 years ago. And the question is, why did it change? And I think it's two things. The first is that the focus was on M, right? You basically got M, the right M, to move at 2%, and you were done, which was kind of the caricature of Milton Friedman's view. And it didn't work. It worked less and less, and people went from M1 to M2 to M3 to L1 to L2 to L3, and they kept falling. So it was very clear that the connection was not right. And then there was the inflation episode of the 70s, which basically said, this is not the way to run monetary policy. But it's absolutely fascinating how it has changed from a focus on M aggregates to nearly a complete ignorance of M, and a focus on
here, right?
A focus on even here to some extent, and a focus on R star and getting R equal to R star and a feedback wall a la Taylor or something. It's really striking, and it's really a very good example of when reality doesn't fit the mole, or the mole doesn't fit reality, then you change the mole. And really is, again, looking back, is quite amazing. You probably, just on your last joke, we probably went too far. And I think that not thinking about aggregates, monetary aggregates of various sorts, is probably wrong. And that's what the credit channel, for example, that Ben Bernanke reintroduced, or some of the things that Philip has talked about, is relevant. But we really went from a quantity-based to a price-based approach. And now, other examples. So, as Larry said, every decade has a new shock which we had not thought about. So, I think the oil shocks, initially there were supply shocks which we had not thought about. I was still a student at the time. But very quickly, I think it was relatively easy to adapt them all. I think that on tariffs, which is kind of a current issue, there used to be a complete separation between macro and trade. I didn't know much trade. I think they didn't know much macro either. And it's clear that we have to integrate. It's happening incredibly fast. So I think, again, we have a structure which, we cannot predict new shocks. I mean, they're surprising by nature. But I think we have the tools. A case in which I felt very confused, and that was probably not the time and the place to be confused, is the financial crisis. Because I arrived, as you may know, at the IMF 2 weeks before Lehman. Having a view of macro and finance, which was, this financial sector, it's really complex. But if I think about arbitrage equations, I'll get it right. I don't need to know who does what. There are millions of people making sure the arbitrage equations work. Why should I care? And I was fairly quickly disabused of that notion. So there was a lot of learning by a lot of doing. So there, and I still think, there has been tremendous progress. I still think there's kind of maybe a fundamental issue, which is what I learned from the Lehman crisis and all that, is that if you looked at any level of aggregation, it looked okay. You really had to go into, the balance sheet of bank X, and so what relations it had to bank Y, and what bank Y had relations at bank X, Z, and so on and so on. And looking at any level of aggregation, short of looking at the beast itself, would have missed it, and we did miss it. And so if it's true, that's worrisome, because this means macroeconomists are going to miss things. There's a sense in which macro is macro and not micro, and we have always assumed, and I think it's right most of the time, that we can look at aggregates, maybe not GDP, but aggregates, and get it right, more or less. And I still have a feeling that one really has to look into the entrails, and I don't exactly know how to relate the two.
Larry.
One thing I come back to, thinking about your questions and this discussion here, is, what was this we're talking about a revolution, and there's the word rational expectations in there. What was that revolution? So I think the essence of that revolution didn't have anything to do with rational expectations. What it had to do with it was a linguistic revolution. That and it was a linguistic revolution that, in some sense, was started by Samuelson in his book Foundations of Economics. He told all economists, that they should start using equations. That mathematicians are talking about the stuff that economists are talking about. So start using this mathematics language. Samuelson also said this language is not for macroeconomics. Macroeconomics too difficult. Just use the ISLM curve that's in my undergraduate textbook, and that's all you need. And
I'll stop you there. It was amazing how schizophrenic Samuelson was, which is when it was micro, it was equations. When it was macro, it was the ISLM at best. And the notion that you could relate the two, he didn't believe for a minute.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I think what Samuelson was saying is that when you think about a complex system, natural language is inadequate. Economics involves lots of balls in the air. Some of them make GDP go down, some make GDP go up, and you want to know which one is going to dominate. And just thinking it through with your normal English verbiage is not useful at all for arriving at that conclusion. I think what Samuelson said to everybody but macroeconomists was, mathematics is the language for thinking about complex systems, and normal language is not appropriate for that. What happened in macro was, after a delay, because Samuelson said don't do it, after a delay, these crazy refugees in Minneapolis, they started mathematizing stuff. And it's true they kind of happened to pick rational expectations, probably because Muth had told them that rationality implied rational expectation, but that turned out that wasn't correct, especially in the new Keynesian model and in the RBC model. Guénéry showed that. So in any case, everybody was working with rational expectations, and they were working with silly models, to be honest. So Samuelson warned, he said, if you bring mathematics to macro, you're going to trivialize it. And they did. They did trivialize it. It was pretty stupid, and you probably had fun with those guys. So, but then what happened is they keep going and going and going, and now we're basically mathematized. So we can think about all the stuff that Samuelson would have thought about in the context of macro, but now we can think about it rigorously using mathematics. And I think without that, there's not going to be any progress on anything. You want to do system 1, system 2, you want to do that verbally, forget it. You're not going to get anywhere doing that. I wanted to say something about the move from M to R, because I was thinking about that again during the talk today in the afternoon. What is money? You have to know what money is to know. That's what M is. It's money. And so it's become increasingly unclear what the heck M is. I mean, I think if you want to make more refined than just the word money, it's something to do with liquidity. It's some kind of an asset or something that allows you to quickly make an expense if you need to. Now, today, everybody, or not everybody, but people in my age bracket can all have equity lines of credit. There's no liquidity. I have no liquidity issue. A lot of firms have lines of credit. So are you supposed to count that in the money supply, the lines of credit? I mean, in some sense you should, because it's liquidity. So I think what happened was it was recognized, and Woodford, in his announcement in 1999, memorable speech in Mexico City at the ECB, he said, the biggest waste of time has been thinking about the demand for money in macroeconomics, and we should stop that right now. And I think all of you must have noticed money does not appear in the new Keynesian model, and only the interest rate. Now, why did Woodford say that? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but one of them was we really don't know how to measure. We don't know what money demand is. We look. By the way, G. William Miller, who is supposed to, he was the person who replaced Arthur Burns in 1978. He became the chair of the Fed. And supposedly he was a weak person, and inflation took off under his watch. But if you looked at the money supply under his watch, it went way down. And then if you go and look at Volcker, he was the big tough guy, Mr. Tough Guy. He raised the interest rate. Well, if you look at the money supply on him, it goes way up. So I think what happened was that people are starting to think, and I think we have more and more reasons every day to think this, that it's very hard to measure money and to know what it is, and it's probably a very fickle thing. That probably are shocks to the demand for liquidity. I'm slowly winding back to Bill Poole's argument that said that the optimal thing to do, if there are a lot of high-frequency shocks in the money supply, is to fix the interest rate. That way you'll automatically accommodate those shocks because they're mainly BS shocks. And central banks have always done this. For example, even during the Volcker period, he claimed that it was a money rule. It was a non-borrowed reserve rule. He claimed that because he wanted to be able to say that the high interest rates that he was generating were determined by markets. You have to blame markets. It's not me. I'm working on non-borrowed reserves. And you don't have a hope of figuring out what non-borrowed reserves are. And but in fact, they were following interest rate rules. And I remember so well, I was at the Minneapolis Fed with all these hard-nosed rational expectations, people who supposedly thought money was neutral. That's what we thought when we were doing our research. Then when we went upstairs to advise the president, we're all thinking about ISLM models, all of us. I'm telling you, even including Rao Agari, who is the most hard-nosed person when he was on the research floor, we were all pushing LM curves and IS curves there. And even during the period with non-borrowed reserves, the Volcker had passed, I think it's a fatwa. Thou shalt not talk about the interest rate. We have nothing to do with the interest rate. We have to practice thinking that. Even in private, we have to pretend that that's what we think. So when we were participating in briefings at the Fed, we would all have to think through with our ISLM. By the way, we're all like classical economists, right? So we're sitting up in the 11th, and that's on the 7th floor. In the 11th floor, we're pushing ISLM curves back and forth in our mind. And the smart guy was the one who could could translate from the interest rate to non-borrowed reserves into a recommendation that involved non-borrowed reserves, but achieved the interest rate target that was desired. So I think that even in times when the Fed just declared it doesn't look at the interest rate, that's determined by somebody else. That was just a big lie. That it's not true. I'll bet the central banks for all times only think about the interest rate. And it makes sense. Bill Poole explained why. Markets are fickle and weird. And sometimes people want to shift into the money liquidity part of their portfolio for random reasons, and sometimes they want to shift back out, partly because of multiple equilibria. I think everyone else is going to sell stock tomorrow, so I want to sell my stock today and get cash. And so Bill Poole understood this and said, you guys should follow an interest rate rule so that every time these guys in the economy all of a sudden want cash, the Fed just gives it to them.
That's what we do.
Good, very good. Anything to add?
Nope.
No? Then it's time for us to listen to the public here and draw fire from our audience.
Thank you. Ben Mull, London School of Economics. Thanks, I enjoyed listening to this. I had a question about linearity. So Massimo sort of alluded to this a bit. So I guess to this day, most DSG models are solved via linearization. If you run a VAR, it's mostly linear. If you estimate these models, it's definitely almost always linear. Sort of how problematic or non-problematic do you think that is? I remember Olivier had a nice piece after the financial crisis called "Where Dangers Lurk," I think, where you were criticizing this assumption that the economy always goes back to steady state. Sort of, have you how do you think about this now? I guess also for Larry, how good or bad or a practice is that?
Okay, let's collect maybe a couple or three.
Well, Philip.
So to some degree, this hour has been a review of the history of economic thought in macro over the last 50 years. Should that be part of what people learn in graduate school?
Luc.
I want to give both of you another chance to disagree a little bit more. I think there's a lot of convergence around, in particular, the complexity of models on the one hand, sort of Larry's take on that, and Olivier's take in terms of starting with partial equilibrium. I'm not sure that always meets in the same place. So the example I have in mind is the following. There's been an enormous amount of progress, I think, made here in academia to work with Hank models. But I broadly see two approaches. One is let's just throw in, also with the richness of data that we now have at our disposal, all sorts of forms of heterogeneity to make it as complex as possible and as close to reality as possible. Versus let's sit back and really think partial equilibrium, small scale, what is the most important heterogeneity at this point in time for the policymakers at hand. These two things are not, in my mind, not necessarily the same, and I do see these two different approaches. And so I wanted to get your view on that, maybe in general on sort of this literature and how you would approach it. What advice you have for the younger researchers in the room? Thanks.
We go?
Yeah.
So, on linearity, I'm not sure what the answer is. I have a sense that most of the time, linearity is probably okay. I mean, kind of normal times. And then you get into what, I call the dark corners. And then it's very easy to think of multiple equilibria. In the context of debt, the issue of multiple equilibria is not there when debt is 40%. It becomes an issue when it's 250. So I don't have a good sense. I think it depends on the question. If you kind of think to mundane reaction functions, probably linearity is not the end of the world. But if you're thinking about Argentina or places where there is more action than that, then you may want to think about where the non-linearities are. That would be the way I would go, depending on the topic. On the history of thought, I have mixed views. I think, first, somebody has to be able to teach it. Unfortunately, the supply is not there. So there is an issue, which is that when Samuelson was teaching history of thought at MIT, it was definitely worth it. Or I would say, the standard thing was Adam Smith said that. I would not have said it this way. I would have said it this way. And then he kept going. But there are very few people. And the people who are very good don't think that they have the time to. The other is, I think there's something good about not knowing, about not being too wise. I find one of my increasing shortcomings is the wisdom. I know too much, and I'm less creative. So, joke apart, I think there's something good about, you have to tell them about the basic stuff, but whether they have read Adam Smith or Hayek or whatever may not be essential. I think as you progress through life, I think it's fun to actually look and realize that what you say has been said by somebody else before. So I have mixed feelings on that as well. And on Hank Moll's, I don't know where the question was Luke. I think you have to go both ways. There are the initial Hank Molls were a complete mess. So there are very nice papers by, I think, like Adrien Auclair and people like this, who basically show, this is the effect and it works this way, and this has this macro implication, or it doesn't have a macro implication. And he didn't try to calibrate it exactly to capture all the heterogeneity, but conceptually, and his papers, I'm probably not citing people I should, but this paper made me understand kind of what was in the black box. I can think of an alternative approach in which, you remember this very old paper now by Pierre-Olivier Gourachas on consumption, which was one of the first papers to try to assess how much was life cycle saving and how much was precautionary saving. And I'd be very happy if somebody started from there and that said, let me put this into a DSG overlapping generation model and see what it implies. I think, and in the end, I suspect the two will converge, but at this stage, I think both are fine.
Larry?
Well, I guess on the linearity thing, so I remember when the Killen and Prescott came out and they proposed this linearization. And I remember all of us thinking, this is ridiculous. They don't know basic math. They don't realize the Taylor's theorem says this is only a good approximation in a small neighborhood. And so what happened was we were going to, show that they were wrong, and we scheduled all these conferences, and teams of people would get together and solve solve the I don't know, neoclassical growth model probably, or RBC model. They would solve the RBC model by different fancy methods to get a really good solution. And then there would be, over in the corner over there would be the linearizer, who would presumably be completely destroyed by the conference. Then repeatedly these conferences happened, and they always showed the same thing, which is, just fine. However, there's a huge footnote to be added to that. That it was just fine as long as you're working with post-war and pre-January 20 this year data for the United States. The pre-war data, for example, the Great Depression, hugely volatile. It's very easy to see that linearization works badly on the US Great Depression. You just have to look at the Euler errors associated with the linearized decision rule, and you can see what the fit, how well the model's working. It does not work well on the Great Depression. My guess is it doesn't work well on most emerging market economies. So there's a kind of a scam going on, which is that everybody talks about linearization, but it works for Europe and for the US, again, up until January 2nd, 20th. Everything after that is off the table. We don't know. So that's the thing about, I think it's important to be cautious about it. We have all the methods to solve nonlinear things, and then with AI, those will get easy, and we can do estimation. As you know, we can do estimation. So, but it is something to think about, and it's done a lot. Now, I wanted to say something about, should we learn something about, is there something to learn? So I thought there was something to learn. I think there's something to learn, which is that we live in a very unusual time right now of, we have, in a sense, 1,000 flowers blooming. People are doing empirical work in all different kinds of ways, and they talk to each other respectfully. Wildly, I mean, if I just look around in my department, the macro group, it's like wildly different things. We have extreme time series econometrics, and then we have extreme, just simple look out the window and smell things as at the other thing, and all comfortably sitting together and talking. And so the history lesson here is and this relates to what Olivier said, was that it doesn't always have to be this way. You don't have to be in this productive equilibrium. In fact, in the early 80s, we were very much in a different equilibrium, where everybody was just shouting at each other and talking over each other's heads and stuff like that. That was during this linguistic transformation. So everybody's supposed to learn Chinese now. And then some people said, well, I don't want to learn Chinese. Well, then all the people who were learning Chinese started shouting at them in Chinese. And so it was a very, very tough time, and I think that stuff is very unproductive. Now, I didn't say what the lesson is. I think that the lesson of this, of how we traveled from that equilibrium to the one we're in now, has a lot to do with a particular institution. And the institution is the MBER. So the MBER kind of brought everybody together in the same place. And, we're walking around in their shorts and in their shirts, in the lawn, chatting in the summer. And then you would also have, like Bob Hall had this policy of, people who run the EF meeting, the people running it were always selected from different, groups, so that you had kind of the EF meetings over time reflected kind of the state of, the macro, and that caused this other equilibrium to slowly grow, where people are civil with each other and learn from each other and allow each other to live and thrive even though we're not all the same. And I think this was going to be my comment about convergence. I don't necessarily want to see convergence. I like to see everybody doing different things. And I used to think in the old days that, without convergence, there would just be battles all the time. But now I realize that doesn't have to be true. And I also realize, I think, that the NBR is the reason for that. It's very important. I think that's a very important lesson.
Yep. Okay, another two questions. I see Guido and Wolfgang.
Question about teaching. You're both teachers. I always find a tension between, part of the revolution has been that, okay, you really have to learn the tools well. And so we always do that. But it's also a tension, like, you want engage the students with actual policy questions, topics like what happened in 2008, what happened in 2020. How do you mix that? How do you yeah.
So, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just one and then.
Going actually in a similar direction on the bridging science and practice, not about for the students, but rather from the realm of giving policy advice. How do you think the profession has changed, or actually looking forward have to change, giving research-based policy advice, taking into account the changing or increasing complexity of the field, but also take into account possibly the changing audience? I mean, central bankers, decision makers have become more academic over time, that's clear. But if you think in a broader policy advice context, there's other institutions that may be less prone to listening to research-based policy advice. So what were your thoughts on this?
Good. So on the first, I don't think you want to be in the position is, I'm going to tell you the truth, take notes. The course that I got from Stan Fisher, we basically spent half the semester on studying Lucas, the hard paper, the Journal of Economic Theory, line by line, and half of the semester learning Barrow-Grossman, which were completely opposite. And I think, just understanding, and then we could come to some position ourselves. But I think that's the way to do it. You want to indicate that there are views. I mean, within convergence, as Larry said, it's not that we should think exactly the same way. But I think you want to indicate that there are different positions and teach stuff that you don't believe. I think that's only fair to the students. On the policy advice, that's a long discussion. I mean, you can see how amazingly well it's working in the US. How we are listened to by the current administration. But leaving this aside and looking at my other home country, France, there's a much better integration of academia and policymakers. It used to be completely separate. The policymakers would not know who the academics were, never met them, and the academics didn't care. I think there's much more integration. Whether we give the right policy advice, that's a long discussion. How much you want to tailor what you say to the political realities, I think is a big issue for any policy advisor. But that's a longer discussion.
So I guess on your question, I think one of the big things that happened in the last 3 decades or so is what happened in research departments at central banks around the world. So you have almost everywhere you go, you have research departments that are very, very sophisticated and have very well-trained people in it. Then there's a question, of course, the governor of the central bank is probably not into all of this stuff, algebra. And the question is, can this long go on or not, or what? And so I think my view about whether governors who don't know, they don't know how the Blanchard-Kahn conditions, the meaning of those things. Governors who don't know those things, that's a good thing. Because it's the highest test of whether you've understood your model and anything, that you can boil it down to. There is a role for natural language, which is you translate your complex model into simple sentences. Once you do that, first of all, you may discover that your model is really stupid. That's a very important test. And another important test is that you bring it to your boss, who insists on it being simple and coherent. And those are very important and valuable tests. Now, hopefully the boss is persuaded that it's a good thing for you to be working so hard to build these models and then translate them into English. I think the way the boss can be convinced of that is to have the people go out and fight each other in conferences and discussions and submissions and stuff like that. And then hopefully that gives rise to a good outcome for everybody.
On this, we are 1 minute ahead of time. Last question, telegraphic.
There's one there.
Anuka.
Yeah, thanks. One question. So when we are hiring new students, we see that not many of them do anymore this, what we consider bread and butter central banking models. They are more into machine learning or Hank models. So the question is, should we also change and leave all of these DSG models behind, or how should we approach monetary policy analysis in the future?
There was a session on this.
So I think Hank models are DSG models. So if, I think it should always be the same kind of thing, which is when you put together a model, you want to make sure that the things that are essential for making the right decisions, the answer is going to be different depending on what decision you're trying to make, like tariff or stabilize or re-anchor inflation expectations or whatever. So depending on what it is that you're trying to do, you want to choose the model that's most suitable. So if there's a question you have where heterogeneity is really very important, then that's the model that you want to work with. But I think models should be chosen based on the question that you're trying to ask. We don't want to have the model be the true model or something like that. Because then we really couldn't understand it in any way. And so it has to be simple enough. So then the question is, what will you leave out and what will you put in? And that's driven by, I think, your judgment about what it takes to get this particular question answered.
Let me add something. I think there's a life cycle to research. So you start, I think, fairly high tech, and then you try to stay fairly close to the frontier as long as you can. And I think that's the way to do it. So there are going to be more high tech than you would want, but I think that's the way to go. On Hank and machine learning, I think these are things that you have to understand. What does it mean about you? People who have been here, I think for a while you try to stay at the frontier and maybe you learn machine learning and you learn how to manipulate Hank models. There is a risk that technology changes in such a way that you all become obsolete. And I think you have to basically be ready to learn some of these new techniques as they come. But I think you should be happy to hire people who know machine learning and know how to solve Hank models.
Okay, and with this vision, we bring it to an end. We are all extremely grateful for the thoughts that you have shared with us so generously, your time coming here. And again, many thanks.
Thank you.
Wolfgang, yes, some announcements.
No worries, not much time left here between you and reception at the dinner. So with this fireside, or rather fireworks chat, it was impressive. We close the first day of the conference. On behalf of the full organizing team, Carlo, Oreste, Sujit, Roberto, let me thank once again Massimo Rostagno and especially our special guests, Olivier Blanchard and Larry Christiano, for this inspiring talk. Thanks a lot. And thanks again to all speakers and discussants today. It was a pleasure, and to all of you for your active participation. I hope, or we hope, to see you all again tomorrow and wish you a nice rest of the evening. Thanks a lot.